Hello, my name's Jim Hall, and it's a great pleasure to be at this conference, albeit online on video. And I'm presenting this work along with my co-author and indeed co-prize winner in the Bin Sultan bin Abdulaziz International Prize for Water, Dr. Eduardo Borromeo. I'm a professor in the University of Oxford. Dr. Borromeo is with the World Bank and also associated with my group in the University of Oxford. And the work I'm going to describe, which was actually led by Dr. Borromeo, is on the multidimensional challenges of water security in the Arab world. The Arab world is rightly regarded as one of the most water scarce regions on the planet compared to the population and the demand for water. But the work which we've been doing has been making the point that the challenges of water security in the Arab world are not just to do with water scarcity, and indeed describing them in terms of water scarcity may not be completely constructive, because there's so much difference between the different countries within the Arab world and the types of challenges that they face and their current status with respect to water security. And in this talk, we're going to try and unpack some of those questions. We're going to look at how climate change adds to those water security risks, how climate change is a risk multiplier, and look at some of the ways in which we might think of responding to those water security risks, many of which are already well developed in some and sometimes all countries within the Arab world, but some of which show more potential for the future compared to the current level of uptake. So first of all, looking at these multiple challenges, as we've already said, the Middle East and North Africa is one of the most water scarce regions in the world. 61% of the population is exposed to high or very high levels of water stress, and 71% of the GDP is exposed. And these are very big numbers compared to other regions of the world. And because of that, we see unsustainable uses of fresh water, especially groundwater. So rates of groundwater depletion, which we can monitor these days with satellite data, are dramatic in parts of the Arab world. In terms of environmental impacts, which I'll talk in a moment, but the draining of wetlands, as we've seen in the lower part of the Euphrates and Tigris basins, has been large-scale changes to the aquatic landscape, which has led to increases in aridity and also issues associated with displaced persons who were previously dependent upon those aquatic environments, which has led potentially to questions of conflict for those displaced persons. There's also an issue of water pollution. So the amount of water which is being treated before it's discharged into freshwater bodies and into the sea is an issue across many of the countries in the region. And so, for example, if we look at the Gaza Strip here, we know that there are major issues with discharges and runoff of nitrates from agriculture, contamination of groundwater, and the risk of eutrophication of the coastal waters. Desalination, as we will see a bit more in a moment, has become a major source of fresh water, in particular in the Gulf, as shown here. And actually the use of desalination has reached such a scale that this is having a significant impact on the salinity of the Gulf, and reaching a point where actually desalination becomes less efficient, where the intake water is of higher salinity, and this is becoming an issue certainly within the Gulf, as well as those brine discharges having an impact on biodiversity in the Gulf. Meanwhile, though we're talking about a water scarce place, there are threats from occasional intense downpours, flash floods, which of course have been a characteristic of the region forever. The landscape and wadis of the desert are shaped by occasional flash floods, but now with human development exposed to those flash floods, they are becoming increasingly harmful hazard for the human populations. And as I've mentioned previously, both in connection with wetlands and in connection with water quality and saline discharges, there are major threats to biodiversity in the region. These are ecosystems which are in some senses extraordinarily well adapted to their arid environment, but on the other hand are quite fragile and vulnerable to changes in water availability and water quality. And that is seen in terms of the numbers of species which are impacted, and in particular the number of threatened species which are impacted by changes in the aquatic environment. And whilst water is a scarce resource in the region, it's not being used particularly productively. So here we're looking at water productivity, the number of US dollars of added value, which are gained from a cubic meter of water. And we see that in some countries in the region, the productivity of water is extremely low. So there's scarce water, but that water is not actually being used in a very productive way in many instances. And for the most part, that is because of water being allocated to agriculture, in which the agricultural productivity is not particularly high. So this raises the question of whether water is being used in the most productive way in the region. The big picture here then is that if we look at sustainable and unsustainable water uses, the red is sustainable, the red is unsustainable, the blue is sustainable, and then on top of that, we put unconventional use of water, reuse, desalination. We can see a very varied picture right the way across the countries of the Arab world. Some much more sustainable than others, some dependent upon surface and groundwater sources, some much more dependent upon desalination and wastewater reuse. So this is a very complex and very varied part of the world we're talking about. And in terms of access to water services, so drinking water sources, which is what's shown here. Again, we see a very varied picture across the region. Ideally, where we want to get to is 100% access to improved drinking water sources. And some of the countries in the region are at that level, but other countries are at much lower levels of access to drinking water, and indeed access to improved sanitation, which is also so important for public health and human well-being. And economic modeling has shown how water insecurity, inadequate water supply and sanitation is really hitting those countries where those essential water services are not well developed, and in particular in the conflict affected countries of the region. Part of the story around these inadequate water services is because the water utilities are not investing enough, both in terms of new infrastructure and in terms of proper operation and maintenance of that infrastructure in order to provide high quality services. And the reason for that, in part, is because the full costs of those water services are not being recovered from the people who are served. In order to sustainably run a water utility, there needs to be enough income in order to pay for the services that are provided. And in many places within the region, the cost of water is just far too low to pay for a viable water utility. So, on top of all of these multiple dimensions and complexities, we have the growing threat of climate change. And climate change is a threat multiplier here. It's adding to the water stress of surface and groundwater sources. So it's pushing that stress level up because there will be higher temperatures, which is driving up evaporation. And regional climate model studies show that we're expecting reductions in precipitation in the region as well. And that means that we're expecting water scarcity to have a growing impact on GDP. But that could be, to some extent, alleviated and in particular, this proves to be the case in other parts of the world, if one's able to reallocate water to higher value usage, so to use water more efficiently. However, in the Arab world, in the MENA region, that will not be sufficient, and actually more radical interventions seem to be needed in order to combat water scarcity. The risk is high. This picture here shows how the Middle East and North Africa is one of the areas where droughts are most likely, these are predictions from climate models, to increase into the future. And then in addition to that, we know there will be sea level rise associated with climate change, and that is going to impact the deltas in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea, and in the Gulf. And here we're looking at the Nile Delta, 50 centimeters of sea level rise, which is what we're expecting by the end of this century, maybe more. 10% of the Nile Delta could be permanently submerged and 4 million people affected. And this is on top of the ongoing process of erosion of the Nile Delta because of the reduced supply of sediment from upstream in the Nile. So the final question is, well, how can we to respond to these risks of water insecurity and climate change? And it's already recognized that wastewater recycling is one of the greatest opportunities within the region. 82% of the water in the region is not recycled, and it could be. This is clearly a much more sustainable solution than desalination, because we don't have the issues of brine discharges and increasing salinity that we saw in the Gulf in the previous slide. And so where we need to be heading towards is a closed loop, a circular water economy, where we're reusing wastewater, extracting resources also from sewage, and extracting energy, which closes the energy loop, whilst at the same time ensuring that there is sufficient water remaining in surface and groundwater bodies to sustain the aquatic environment. That sustaining the aquatic environment is incredibly important to build resilience for ecosystems. And so there's a potential side effect here from very extensive wastewater recovery without putting enough water back into the environment. Meanwhile, resources, nutrients, energy, in particular from sewage, provide opportunities for fertilizers and energy from biogas. Within the urban environment, we've referred to those occasional shocks from extreme rainfall, and so creating green space in the urban environment, which is able to deal with surface water flooding, expanding wetlands, giving room to rivers, is a big opportunity. And the other opportunity out there is the rapidly increasing amount of data for hydrological forecasting and warning, and this is particularly significant in relation to droughts, where using satellite data we can monitor droughts in real time and combine that with forecasting models in order to inform management plans, for example, in relation to water allocation and agricultural decision-making at the farm level. That was a very high-speed tour through a very complex part of the world. But what I've tried to illustrate is that water security is much more than dealing with just water scarcity. The Middle East and North Africa is water scarce, but what I've shown is that the story is very complex. There's a lot of variability between the countries of the region. Some of that comes down to governance, the strength of water utilities, the relative emphasis on agriculture, the degree of technological update, for example, in relation to wastewater reuse. And though this is an incredibly challenging part of the world, and conflict layers on top of those challenges and challenges water governance in particular, there are potential responses which mean that water can be used more sustainably and water security can be built up within the region. through a combination of technological interventions, policy reforms, institutional arrangements, which will strengthen water security within the region. And much of what I've just talked about here is written up in this paper in Earth's Future, led by Eduardo Borromeo, with a number of colleagues from the region and from the International Water Management Institute, IMI, who I should acknowledge as well. So it's been a great pleasure talking to you. I wish you an extremely successful conference and look forward to future collaborations.